Hello, my dear friends. If you were alive in the year 536, you would not have known that historians many centuries later would call it one of the worst years in human history. You would not have heard the phrase climate disaster or volcanic winter. You would only have known that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, people began to notice something strange in the sky. The sun no longer shone clearly. It rose each morning, but its light felt weak, pale, almost like the moon. Ancient writers described it as giving light without brightness. Days felt dim. Shadows faded. Even at midday, the world looked dull and muted. This was not a passing cloud, it lasted for months. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light, without brightness like the moon, during the whole year. In Italy, the statesman Cassiodorus described a sun that seemed blue and crops that failed. In Syria, chroniclers recorded a darkened sun and famine that followed. In China, records speak of frost in summer and snow during harvest season. Something enormous had happened, but the people living through it did not know what. Modern science now suggests that in early 536, a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, sent vast amounts of ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere. This material spread across the northern hemisphere, blocking sunlight. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Studies of tree rings show that 536 and the years immediately following were among the coldest of the last 2,000 years. But in 536, there were no tree ring studies, there were only hungry fields. Crops began to fail across wide regions. In Ireland, historical records later called it a failure of bread. In parts of Scandinavia, farming became nearly impossible. Short growing seasons meant grain did not ripen. Livestock weakened. Famine followed naturally. And famine brings more than hunger. It brings migration, social tension, theft, disease, and death. In the Byzantine Empire, already strained by wars and political pressure, the darkened sky worsened instability. Trade routes were disrupted. Grain shipments became unreliable. Urban centers, dependent on steady food supply, felt the pressure immediately. When food becomes scarce in a city, fear spreads faster than fire. Meanwhile, in China, the Northern Wei dynasty faced widespread crop loss. Some reports describe frost even in midsummer. Livestock died. Entire communities were displaced. The skies were described as yellow or dusty, the sun weak. For people living through 536, the cause could only be guessed. Many interpreted it as divine punishment. Others feared the end of the world. Apocalyptic thinking intensified. When the sun dims and the harvest fails, it is not difficult to imagine judgment. And yet 536 was only the beginning. Because just as the world struggled to adjust to darkness and cold, another eruption struck in 540 or 541. Temperatures dropped again. Recovery became impossible. Agriculture failed repeatedly. Entire regions were weakened for years. Then in 541, something else arrived, the plague of Justinian. Carried along trade routes, the plague swept through the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Cities already weakened by famine and malnutrition were hit hardest. Constantinople reportedly lost thousands per day at the height of the outbreak. Modern estimates suggest tens of millions died across Eurasia in the following decades. So when historians call 536 the worst year to be alive, they do not mean that it alone destroyed civilization. They mean that it marked the beginning of a chain reaction: climate shock, crop failure, famine, plague, economic collapse, and social transformation. Tree ring data confirms the sudden cooling. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show spikes in volcanic material around this time. The evidence aligns with the ancient accounts. The dim sun was real. The cold was measurable. For those living then, however, there were no global maps or scientific explanations. There was only confusion. The seasons stopped behaving normally. Hunger became common. Trust and stability began to fade. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests entire settlements were abandoned. Some historians believe the population decline may have influenced later Viking migration centuries afterward. In the Mediterranean world, the Byzantine Empire never fully regained its previous strength. The economic and demographic damage lasted generations. What makes 536 so haunting is not just the darkness but the uncertainty. People did not know when it would end. Each dim sunrise brought doubt. Each failed harvest deepened despair. The sky itself had changed, and when the sky changes, everything below it trembles. When the strange dimming of the sun continued beyond a few weeks and stretched into many months, fear began to settle deeply into daily life. This was not a single bad season. It was not a storm that passed. It was a change in the rhythm of the world itself. Farmers woke before dawn as they always had, stepped into their fields, and waited for warmth that did not fully arrive. The light felt thin. The air felt colder than it should have been. Even in regions where snow did not fall, there was a lingering chill that refused to leave. Growing seasons shortened in ways people could not explain. Grain that normally rose strong and golden instead remained stunted and pale. Fruit trees blossomed weakly. Livestock, already dependent on harvested fodder, struggled to survive when fields produced less than usual. In agricultural societies, survival depends on predictability. The year is measured not by dates but by planting, growing, harvesting, and storing. When those markers collapse, stability collapses with them. Communities that had survived wars and political change found themselves facing something more frightening: the loss of natural order. If the sun could dim for a year, what else might fail? In Ireland, chroniclers later recorded a failure of bread between 536 and 539. In parts of Gaul and Italy, crop failures forced communities to rely on whatever reserves they had stored. But reserves do not last forever. And when winter comes after a weak harvest, fear grows sharper. Across the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian was attempting to restore Roman glory. His generals fought campaigns in Italy and North Africa. Ambitious building projects, including the Hagia Sophia, were underway. Yet beneath imperial ambition, ordinary people faced hunger. Grain shipments from Egypt, vital to Constantinople, became uncertain as climate disruption affected multiple regions at once. The empire relied on complex trade networks, and those networks were sensitive to environmental shock. A weak harvest in one region might be manageable. A widespread climatic downturn was not. Contemporary writers struggled to describe what they saw. Procopius noted the sun without brightness. Cassiodorus wrote that shadows were faint at midday, and that the seasons seemed confused. These were educated observers, men who understood politics and administration, yet they had no framework to describe atmospheric volcanic aerosols. Their language was poetic because scientific vocabulary did not yet exist. They spoke of the sun as sick, as weakened, as unnatural. Their descriptions, though simple, align remarkably with modern climate modeling that shows sulfur particles reflecting sunlight back into space. The cooling was not mild. Modern estimates suggest average temperatures across parts of the northern hemisphere may have dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. That may sound small, but in pre-industrial agriculture, even slight drops can devastate yields. Tree ring data from Europe and Asia shows severely reduced growth in 536 and the years immediately following. These narrow rings are silent witnesses to cold summers and stressed ecosystems. The land itself recorded the disaster. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests widespread abandonment of farms during this period. Pollen records indicate a sharp decline in agricultural activity. Some historians believe up to half the population in parts of Sweden may have died or migrated. Later Norse mythology speaks of a great winter, Fimbulwinter, a long cold before the end of the world. While myths cannot be treated as direct historical records, it is possible that memories of extreme climatic events lingered in cultural storytelling for generations. In China, historical chronicles describe unusual frost in summer and snow during the warmest months. Crops failed. Famine followed. Reports mention cannibalism in extreme cases, though such accounts must be read carefully. What is clear is that food shortages were severe. When agricultural societies collapse, suffering spreads beyond hunger. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Disease spreads more easily. Social order becomes fragile, and this fragility set the stage for what came next. In 541, only 5 years after the first dimming, the plague of Justinian erupted in Egypt and rapidly spread throughout the Byzantine Empire. Modern research identifies it as an outbreak of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the later Black Death. But in the 540s, populations were already weakened by years of poor harvests. Malnourished bodies cannot resist infection effectively. The climate shock did not directly cause the plague, but it created conditions in which disease could move more efficiently and kill more widely. Constantinople, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, suffered immensely. Contemporary accounts claim thousands died each day at the height of the outbreak. Bodies were stacked in buildings. Burial systems collapsed under pressure. Trade slowed. Fear intensified. The empire's ability to wage war weakened dramatically. Justinian's dream of restoring Roman territories became harder to sustain. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, already fragmented after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, smaller kingdoms struggled quietly. Fewer written records survive from these regions, but archaeological data suggests population decline and settlement disruption. The combined effects of climate cooling and plague altered demographic patterns for generations. What makes 536 uniquely devastating is not simply the dim sun or the cold year, but the cascade of consequences. One eruption in a distant northern landscape sent particles high into the atmosphere. Those particles spread across continents. Sunlight weakened. Temperatures dropped. Crops failed. Famine weakened populations. Disease struck. Empires faltered. Trade networks shifted. Migration patterns changed. All from an event no one could see directly. For the people living through it, there was no explanation that satisfied. Some believed God was punishing humanity. Others feared the end times. Apocalyptic thinking grew stronger in Christian and non-Christian societies alike. When nature behaves unpredictably, Spiritual interpretation fills the gap, and yet life continued. Farmers planted again the next year, hoping for improvement. Merchants reopened trade routes when they could. Leaders attempted to maintain authority. Human resilience did not vanish, but it was tested severely. Modern historians debate whether 536 was truly the single worst year to be alive. Other years brought wars, invasions, and pandemics. But few years combined climate catastrophe, agricultural collapse, and pandemic in such tight sequence. Few years began a decade of sustained hardship that reshaped continents. When we look back at 536 through ice cores and tree rings, through chronicles and archaeology, we see a reminder of how vulnerable human civilization is to forces beyond its control. A volcano erupts, the sky dims, and the chain reaction begins. The people of 536 did not know they were standing at the edge of one of the most difficult decades in recorded history. They only knew that the sun had changed, the air had grown cold, and the harvest was failing. And in an agricultural world, that was enough to turn hope into fear. As the strange darkness stretched from months into years, the psychological weight of 536 and its aftermath began to settle heavily on societies that depended completely on the rhythm of nature. In a pre-industrial world, there was no separation between climate and survival. A dim sun was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Each growing season that failed chipped away at food reserves, and with every failed harvest, the fragile balance between population and production collapsed further. What made this period especially devastating was repetition. One bad year could sometimes be survived through stored grain and community cooperation. 2 or 3 consecutive poor harvests pushed entire regions into desperation. The volcanic event of 536 appears to have been followed by another major eruption around 540. Ice core evidence from Greenland shows a second spike of volcanic sulfate. This suggests that just as some areas were beginning to recover, the atmosphere darkened again. Cooling intensified. Agricultural recovery stalled. This second climatic blow deepened the crisis across Eurasia. In the Mediterranean basin, wheat production, already weakened, remained unstable. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, experienced irregular Nile flooding patterns during this era, further complicating grain supply. The empire's complex taxation system depended on predictable harvests. When crops declined, tax collection faltered. When taxes faltered, military campaigns suffered. Justinian's reconquest of Italy and North Africa became financially strained at the exact moment stability was needed most. In Northern Europe, where agricultural margins were already narrow, even slight temperature drops had dramatic effects. In Scandinavia, archaeological findings suggest that many highland farms were abandoned permanently during this period. Settlements that had survived for centuries suddenly disappear from the record. Some historians argue that population decline may have reached catastrophic levels in certain regions, though exact numbers remain debated. Burial sites indicate shifts in ritual practices, possibly reflecting trauma or demographic change. China's Northern Wei and later Northern Zhou dynasties also endured repeated famines during the mid-6th century. Historical records describe severe droughts, cold spells, and widespread hunger. Government relief efforts struggled to keep pace with need. In agrarian states where legitimacy depended on the mandate of heaven, the belief that rulers governed with divine approval, Natural disasters carried political consequences. Climate instability could be interpreted as a sign that heaven withdrew support. This interpretation sometimes triggered rebellion or administrative reform. Beyond the political and economic impact, there was also cultural and psychological transformation. When environmental catastrophe strikes repeatedly, belief systems adapt. Apocalyptic expectations rose in many Christian communities. Sermons and writings from this era often emphasized divine judgment and the fragility of worldly power. In some regions, religious devotion intensified. In others, local superstition grew stronger. When scientific explanation is absent, fear searches for meaning. The plague that began in 541 magnified everything. Known today as the Plague of Justinian, it spread rapidly along Mediterranean trade routes. Grain ships, merchant caravans, and military movements unknowingly carried infected fleas and rodents into dense urban centers. Constantinople was hit with staggering force. Contemporary chroniclers, though prone to exaggeration, describe streets filled with corpses and administrative systems collapsing under the scale of death. Modern historians estimate that the plague may have killed between 25 and 50 million people across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia over multiple waves. If accurate, this would represent a massive demographic shock. Entire villages vanished. Labor shortages followed. Agricultural land was left untended. Economic systems already weakened by climate disruption struggled to recover. The combination of volcanic cooling and plague did not destroy civilization outright, but it reshaped it. The Byzantine Empire never fully regained the strength it possessed before the 540s. Military resources dwindled. Defensive capacity weakened. In later centuries, this vulnerability would influence the empire's ability to resist external pressures from Persia and later from emerging Islamic powers. In Western Europe, smaller kingdoms developed under conditions of reduced population and limited centralized authority. Some historians argue that the long-term economic contraction of the late 6th century slowed urban growth and trade development for generations. The post-Roman world became more localized, more rural, and less interconnected for a time. Even in regions less directly affected, global climate systems do not operate in isolation. Evidence from tree rings in Central Asia and the Altai region shows reduced growth during this period. Environmental stress may have contributed to migration patterns among nomadic groups. Movements of steppe populations often ripple outward, influencing borders and power balances far beyond their origin. What stands out most when examining 536 and the years that followed is the scale of interconnected impact. A volcanic eruption, likely far from major population centers, triggered atmospheric changes. These changes reduced solar radiation. Reduced solar radiation shortened growing seasons. Shortened growing seasons weakened societies. Weakened societies became vulnerable to disease. Disease reshaped empires, and yet humanity endured. Communities adapted. Some shifted agricultural strategies. Others migrated to more stable regions. Trade routes eventually reopened. Political structures reformed under new leadership. The darkness did not last forever. Ice core evidence suggests atmospheric clarity gradually returned after several years. Temperatures slowly normalized. But recovery was not immediate. It took decades for populations and economies to stabilize. The year 536 is often described as the worst year to be alive, not because suffering began and ended within 12 months, but because it initiated a chain of disasters that defined an entire decade and beyond. It marked the beginning of sustained hardship on a continental scale. For those who lived through it, there was no global awareness of shared suffering. A farmer in Gaul did not know that frost struck China. A merchant in Alexandria did not know of abandoned farms in Sweden. Each community experienced its crisis locally, interpreting it through its own beliefs. Only centuries later would historians connect these events into a single climatic narrative. Today, with satellite data and climate models, we understand how a volcanic eruption can alter the planet's temperature. But 536 reminds us that ancient societies were equally dependent on environmental stability, even if they lacked tools to measure it. The thin veil of sunlight that year revealed how delicate the balance truly was. The sky dimmed. The harvest failed. Disease spread. Empires weakened. And across the northern hemisphere, humanity entered one of the harshest periods of late antiquity, an era shaped not only by politics and war, but by the atmosphere itself. As the decade of darkness unfolded, the consequences of 536 and the years that followed began reaching far beyond failed harvests and immediate famine. The environmental shock did not simply pass like a storm. It reshaped societies in slow, structural ways that would echo for generations. When food becomes scarce and disease reduces population, the entire foundation of a civilization quietly shifts. In the Byzantine Empire, the impact was profound. Justinian had envisioned restoring Roman dominance across the Mediterranean. His generals had achieved remarkable victories in North Africa and Italy. Yet maintaining an empire requires more than military success. It requires stable taxation, consistent agricultural output, and healthy population centers. The plague, following years of climate stress, dramatically reduced manpower. Fewer farmers meant less grain. Fewer workers meant slower construction and weakened infrastructure. Military recruitment declined. Economic confidence faltered. Even the great city of Constantinople, once a symbol of imperial strength, felt fragile. Contemporary writers describe entire neighborhoods falling silent. Administrative offices struggled to function as officials succumbed to disease. Burial grounds overflowed. Though the city survived, it never fully returned to its earlier demographic height during Justinian's reign. The empire endured, but it entered a long period of contraction and defensive struggle rather than expansion. In Western Europe, where centralized Roman authority had already fragmented, the crisis deepened ruralization. Urban life, already diminished after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, became even less stable. Trade networks shrank. Coin circulation declined. Local economies grew more self-contained. This period of economic contraction likely contributed to the slower urban development seen in early medieval Europe compared to the classical world that preceded it. Scandinavia experienced particularly sharp demographic disruption. Archaeological surveys reveal abandoned settlements and a decline in agricultural activity during the mid-6th century. Some researchers believe up to 40 or 50% of the population may have perished in certain regions, though precise figures remain debated. What is clear is that the social landscape changed dramatically. With fewer people and reduced farmland, power structures shifted. Later, Scandinavian legends speak of a long winter before a great renewal. While myth cannot be treated as direct evidence, it is possible that cultural memory preserved echoes of this climatic catastrophe. In parts of Central Asia, environmental stress may have influenced nomadic migrations. When pasture land fails, pastoral societies must move. Movements of steppe peoples often create pressure along borders of settled empires. Though it is difficult to draw direct lines of causation, climate instability in one region can cascade into geopolitical consequences elsewhere. The 6th century saw shifts among groups such as the Avars and other nomadic confederations, whose movements affected Eastern Europe and the Byzantine frontier. Meanwhile, in East Asia, famine and instability tested dynastic legitimacy. The mandate of heaven concept meant that rulers were judged by their ability to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Prolonged environmental disaster could be interpreted as divine disapproval. Such beliefs sometimes fueled political unrest. While the Northern Zhou and later Sui dynasties eventually consolidated power, the mid-6th century was marked by hardship and strain. The cumulative effect of these disruptions suggests that 536 was not merely a bad year. It was a turning point in late antiquity. Some historians argue that the period between 536 and roughly 550 marked the beginning of what is sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a cooler climatic phase lasting decades. This prolonged cooling compounded political and economic vulnerability. What makes this episode especially striking is how interconnected its consequences were, despite the lack of global awareness at the time. A volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or possibly multiple eruptions, sent sulfur aerosols high into the stratosphere. These particles reflected sunlight and altered atmospheric circulation patterns. Monsoon systems may have weakened. Seasonal cycles shifted. The result was not localized disruption, but hemispheric instability. For individuals, however, history did not feel hemispheric. It felt immediate. A mother watching her children grow thin, a farmer staring at fields that refused to ripen, a merchant calculating losses as trade slowed, a ruler trying to maintain authority while resources dwindled. The catastrophe was experienced at human scale, even if its origins were planetary. Yet resilience persisted. Communities adapted by shifting crops where possible. Some regions relied more heavily on livestock. Others reduced population pressure through migration. Over time, new social orders emerged from the demographic vacuum. Labor scarcity in certain areas altered power relationships between landowners and peasants. Political realignments gradually reshaped borders. By the late 6th century, skies cleared and temperatures slowly stabilized. But recovery was uneven. Entire generations had grown up under scarcity. The psychological imprint of repeated disaster may have influenced cultural developments, religious intensity, and mythic storytelling. Apocalyptic themes remained strong in both Christian and non-Christian traditions. Modern research using ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica confirms that volcanic sulfate deposits peak around 536 and again around 540. Tree ring data across Europe, Asia, and North America show suppressed growth during these years. These scientific records align remarkably with the written accounts preserved in Byzantine, Syriac, Irish, and Chinese sources. Together, they form a coherent picture of global climatic shock. The year 536 did not destroy civilization. but it weakened it. It reduced populations, strained economies, altered political trajectories, and reshaped cultural memory. It demonstrated how dependent even powerful empires are on stable climate. When the atmosphere shifts, armies and palaces offer little protection. For those who survived the decade that followed, life slowly resumed its rhythm. Fields were replanted. Trade cautiously resumed. Children were born into a world still fragile but recovering. The darkness lifted, yet its consequences lingered quietly in altered demographics and changed power balances. And so 536 stands in history not simply as a year of dim sunlight, but as the opening chapter of one of the most challenging periods of late antiquity, a reminder that sometimes the greatest forces shaping human destiny are not kings or generals, but the sky itself. As the 6th century moved forward and the immediate terror of darkened skies slowly faded, the deeper consequences of the crisis that began in 536 continued unfolding in ways that were not immediately visible. The atmosphere eventually cleared, sunlight regained its strength, and temperatures gradually stabilized, yet the demographic and economic scars remained embedded within societies across Eurasia. Recovery after such sustained disruption does not occur in a single season. It unfolds over decades, sometimes generations, and the mid-6th century offers a powerful example of how environmental catastrophe can permanently alter the trajectory of civilizations. In the Byzantine Empire, the combination of climate shock and the plague of Justinian created a structural weakening that historians continue to analyze. Justinian's ambitions to restore Roman dominance had already stretched imperial resources thin. After the plague waves of the 540s and beyond, manpower shortages became chronic. Agricultural land in some provinces went uncultivated due to population loss. Tax revenues declined sharply. The empire increasingly shifted from expansion to defense, consolidating rather than conquering. Though the Byzantine state survived for centuries afterward, it entered a new phase of contraction and militarization, shaped in part by the demographic collapse of this era. Western Europe, fragmented into post-Roman kingdoms, experienced an even more localized transformation. With fewer people to work the land and maintain urban centers, rural life became dominant. Archaeological records show declining urban construction and reduced long-distance trade. Coinage circulation fell in certain regions, indicating economic contraction. Power shifted toward local lords and smaller political units. The transformation was gradual, but the mid-6th century likely accelerated processes that were already underway, deepening the divide between the classical urban world and the emerging medieval order. In Scandinavia, the archaeological picture remains one of the most striking. Evidence suggests a significant decline in settlement density during the decades following 536. Some researchers propose that entire communities vanished. Burial patterns changed. Elite structures appear in different forms later, suggesting political realignment. While it is impossible to draw a direct line from 536 to later Viking expansion centuries afterward, some historians speculate that demographic recovery and social restructuring during this period may have laid groundwork for future maritime migration. Trauma can reshape cultural identity, and long memories sometimes influence long-term behavior. In East Asia, climatic disturbances continued affecting dynastic stability. Chinese historical records describe repeated agricultural hardship in the mid-6th century. While the Sui dynasty eventually unified China in 589, the decades before that unification were marked by instability and struggle. Environmental stress likely compounded political tensions. The mandate of heaven concept meant that rulers were held responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven and earth, so prolonged disaster undermined confidence in leadership. What makes the story of 536 particularly compelling in modern scholarship is how historians reconstructed it. For centuries, references to a darkened sun in ancient chronicles were treated as isolated literary exaggerations. It was not until the 20th and 21st centuries that interdisciplinary research began linking written accounts with scientific evidence. Ice cores drilled from Greenland revealed distinct layers rich in volcanic sulfate, dated precisely to 536, and again around 540. These chemical signatures provide direct physical evidence of major eruptions. Tree ring studies across Europe, Asia, and North America showed suppressed growth during these same years, confirming unusually cold summers. This combination of textual and scientific data transformed understanding of late antiquity. Rather than viewing the mid-6th century purely through political or military narratives, historians began recognizing climate as a driving force. The term Late Antique Little Ice Age emerged to describe a period of cooling roughly from 536 into the mid-7th century. Though not a full ice age, this extended cooling phase likely influenced agriculture, migration, and economic development for decades. The lesson of 536 is not simply that one year was catastrophic. It is that environmental shocks can initiate cascading effects that reshape societies far beyond the immediate event. Climate interacts with disease. Disease interacts with economy. Economy interacts with politics. The chain reaction is complex, and 536 provides one of the earliest well-documented examples of such interconnected crisis. For the people who lived through it, none of this analysis existed. They experienced the crisis as a series of personal tragedies: failed harvests, lost children, empty markets, silent neighbors. They did not know that volcanic aerosols were blocking sunlight. They did not understand atmospheric circulation patterns. They interpreted the event through the language available to them: divine displeasure, omens, cosmic imbalance. Yet despite the devastation, civilization did not collapse entirely. Human societies proved adaptable. Agricultural techniques shifted. Political systems reorganized. Trade eventually revived in modified forms. Populations slowly rebounded. The resilience of human communities, even in the face of global environmental disaster, is as much a part of the story as the suffering itself. The year 536 therefore stands at a crossroads in history. It marks the beginning of one of the most severe environmental downturns of the last 2 millennia. It coincides with the first pandemic plague outbreak recorded in European and Mediterranean history. It contributes to demographic decline, economic contraction, and geopolitical transformation across multiple continents. Modern climate scientists and historians continue studying this period not only to understand the past, but to understand vulnerability. The events of 536 demonstrate that even advanced and powerful societies can be destabilized by environmental forces beyond their immediate control. In a world deeply dependent on stable climate patterns, sudden atmospheric disruption can ripple through every level of civilization. When we look back at that dimmed sun described by Procopius and others, we are not simply reading poetic metaphor. We are witnessing an ancient record of planetary scale disruption. The sky changed, and with it, the course of history. And though the darkness eventually lifted, the memory of those years lingered quietly in altered empires, reshaped populations, and the fragile awareness that human power rests beneath forces far larger than itself. As the years moved beyond the immediate shock of the 530s and 540s, the world did not suddenly brighten in spirit, just because the skies slowly cleared. Recovery from a crisis of that scale does not feel dramatic. It feels uneven. Some regions stabilized more quickly while others remained weakened for decades. The cooling phase that began in 536 lingered in subtle ways, and even when temperatures began returning toward normal patterns, agricultural systems had already been disrupted. Seeds had been lost. Fields had gone untended. Labor forces had shrunk. Rebuilding required time, and time in a fragile world was always uncertain. One of the most significant long-term consequences of this period was demographic transformation. Population decline across Europe and parts of Asia altered land use patterns. With fewer people to cultivate marginal lands, some regions reverted to forest. Pollen data from lake sediments in parts of Europe shows reforestation during the later 6th century. Fields that had once produced grain became wild again. This was not planned environmental change. It was the quiet result of absence. Labor scarcity also shifted social dynamics. In certain areas, surviving workers gained slightly more leverage, simply because they were needed. While rigid hierarchies did not vanish, economic relationships adjusted subtly. Landowners could not ignore the reality that fields required hands. This demographic imbalance would influence patterns of settlement and agricultural organization well into the early medieval period. Trade networks, once robust across the Mediterranean and Silk Road corridors, contracted but did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. Some luxury goods became rarer. Regional exchange became more dominant than long-distance commerce for a time. Economic systems simplified in certain areas, relying more heavily on local production. This contraction contributed to what some historians describe as a narrowing of the economic world during the early Middle Ages. The psychological dimension of 536 and its aftermath is more difficult to measure, yet it likely shaped cultural development. Repeated environmental failure, famine, and plague reinforced a worldview in which human life appeared fragile and unpredictable. Apocalyptic imagery in religious writings intensified during this era. The sense that divine forces governed stability became more deeply embedded in collective consciousness. When the natural order seems unstable, spiritual explanation becomes both comfort and warning. In Scandinavia, memories of prolonged cold may have persisted in oral tradition. Later Norse mythology speaks of Fimbulwinter, a devastating long winter preceding Ragnarok. While myths cannot be taken as literal historical accounts, they often preserve echoes of real experiences. A prolonged climatic downturn, severe enough to threaten survival, would leave a mark on cultural imagination. In the Byzantine Empire, the weakened state created by plague and climate disruption altered geopolitical balance. Persia and later emerging Islamic powers would challenge imperial territory in the centuries that followed. While 536 alone did not determine these conflicts, the demographic and economic strain of the mid-6th century reduced the empire's resilience. History rarely turns on a single event, but certain events reduce margin for recovery. In China, dynastic consolidation eventually restored relative stability under the Sui and later Tang dynasties. Yet the mid-6th century hardships contributed to cycles of reform and restructuring. Environmental crisis often exposes weaknesses in governance, forcing adaptation. In this way, 536 and its related climatic disturbances became catalysts for long-term political change, even if indirectly. Modern science has allowed historians to see this episode with clarity unavailable to those who lived through it. Ice core analysis, dendrochronology, and volcanic ash deposits have transformed scattered historical references into a coherent climatic narrative. The dim sun described by 6th century writers is no longer mysterious poetry. It aligns precisely with measurable atmospheric events. This convergence of historical text and scientific data makes 536 one of the best documented environmental crises of the ancient world. What makes this story especially powerful is its reminder of interconnected vulnerability. A volcanic eruption in a remote northern region altered atmospheric chemistry. That alteration reduced sunlight across continents. Reduced sunlight shortened growing seasons. Shortened growing seasons weakened societies. Weakened societies became vulnerable to disease. Disease reshaped political and economic systems. Each link in the chain was natural. Together, they were transformative. Yet even in the shadow of catastrophe, human adaptability persisted. Communities reorganized. Agricultural techniques evolved. Trade found new routes. Political systems adjusted to new realities. Children were born into a recovering world. The darkness did not erase humanity's capacity to rebuild. The year 536 therefore stands not only as a symbol of disaster, but as a case study in resilience under extreme stress. It shows how fragile civilization can be, and how slowly stability returns once broken. It reminds us that environmental forces operate on scales larger than individual ambition, yet individuals still endure within them. And as decades passed and new generations grew up under clearer skies, the memory of that dim sun slowly faded into chronicles and legend. The atmosphere recovered. Harvests stabilized. Life continued, shaped quietly by an event few fully understood at the time, but one that left its mark across continents. As the later 6th century unfolded under skies that had finally begun to clear, the world did not simply return to what it had been before 536. Civilizations rarely rewind. Instead, they adjust, often permanently. The decades after the initial volcanic dimming and the waves of plague became a long period of quiet restructuring. The catastrophe had exposed weaknesses in political systems, agricultural dependence, and demographic balance. What followed was not dramatic collapse, but gradual transformation. In the Byzantine Empire, the reduction in population reshaped urban life. Constantinople survived, but it became a different city. Neighborhoods that once buzzed with trade and administrative activity became quieter. Some public spaces fell into partial neglect. Imperial resources were redirected toward defense and containment rather than expansion. Justinian's ambitious reconquest left the empire overstretched, and the plague ensured that maintaining these territories required more effort than before. Over time, the empire evolved into a more compact, militarized state, prioritizing survival over restoration of Roman grandeur. In Italy, the Gothic Wars had already devastated infrastructure. When climate stress and plague layered on top of war damage, agricultural productivity collapsed in many regions. Fields went fallow, aqueducts fell into disrepair, urban populations shrank significantly. Rome itself, once the heart of an empire, dwindled to a shadow of its former size. The shift from classical urbanism to a more rural, localized society accelerated during this period. The mid-6th century did not invent this change, but it intensified it. Across Gaul and parts of what is now Germany, smaller kingdoms such as the Merovingians navigated the post-crisis landscape with limited centralized control. Population decline may have eased pressure on land resources temporarily, but economic complexity diminished. Coinage circulation dropped in some regions, indicating reduced trade activity. Society became more agrarian and less urbanized, laying foundations for the early medieval social order that would define Europe for centuries. In Scandinavia, where the demographic shock appears to have been particularly sharp, recovery may have been slow and uneven. Some archaeological sites show long gaps in habitation. The reduction in population may have altered clan structures and power hierarchies. When communities lose large numbers of people, leadership vacuums emerge. Over generations, these shifts can reshape social identity. While it is speculative to draw direct lines from 536 to later Viking expansion, the long-term reorganization of Scandinavian society likely played a role in how power consolidated and maritime culture developed in later centuries. In Central Asia, environmental stress could have influenced mobility among nomadic groups. Pastoral societies are highly sensitive to changes in grazing patterns. If colder temperatures and reduced vegetation affected steppe regions, tribes would have been forced to migrate in search of better conditions. Such movements often trigger wider geopolitical ripple effects. The Avars, for example, entered Eastern Europe in the later 6th century, altering power balances along the Byzantine frontier. While climate cannot be blamed solely for migration, environmental instability often acts as a catalyst. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the eventual rise of the Sui dynasty and later the Tang dynasty brought political consolidation after periods of fragmentation. Though the climatic downturn of the 530s and 540s did not determine Chinese history alone, it contributed to cycles of hardship that tested governance structures. Large states depend on agricultural surplus. When that surplus falters, political legitimacy weakens. Recovery required administrative reform and infrastructural rebuilding. One of the most striking aspects of the post-536 world is how environmental trauma may have shaped cultural expression. Apocalyptic themes remained strong in Christian texts of the period. Sermons emphasized repentance and divine judgment. In the Near East, religious communities interpreted disaster through theological frameworks that reinforced moral order. When the sun dims and famine spreads, people seek meaning. Spiritual narratives provide structure when physical stability falters. At the same time, the crisis likely influenced migration patterns that shaped medieval Europe's future. As populations declined unevenly, some regions experienced labor shortages, while others remained comparatively stable. Over decades, This imbalance may have encouraged movement into less populated territories. Settlement patterns shifted. Borders hardened or dissolved. The early medieval map was not drawn solely by kings and generals. It was also drawn by climate and disease. Modern scholars often describe 536 and the following decades as a hinge between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. The Roman world had already been transforming for centuries, but the combined shock of volcanic cooling and plague accelerated the transition. Urban contraction, economic simplification, political fragmentation, and demographic decline became defining characteristics of the period. And yet, amid all this, humanity did not cease to create, build, and adapt. Monasteries expanded in certain regions, preserving learning and agricultural knowledge. Local trade networks continued functioning, even if reduced in scale. Children born in the 550s and 560s grew up knowing nothing of the bright pre-536 skies. For them, the world they inherited was normal. This is perhaps the most profound truth about 536. For those who lived through it, it was a crisis. For those born after it, it became background reality. Societies adjusted their expectations downward and then stabilized around new norms. What once seemed catastrophic became history, and so, as the 6th century progressed toward its close, the immediate memory of the dim sun slowly blended into collective experience. The scars remained, in altered empires, in reduced populations, in reshaped economies, but the world continued forward, changed, yet persistent. As the later decades of the 6th century settled into a fragile stability, the deeper transformation of the post-536 world became more visible, not in sudden revolutions, but in slow structural change. Civilizations that had once depended on dense urban centers, long-distance trade, and steady agricultural surplus began reorganizing themselves around smaller, more localized systems. The shock of climate collapse and plague had thinned populations so dramatically that many regions could no longer sustain the same scale of complexity they once had. What emerged instead was a quieter, more regional world. In the Mediterranean basin, the dream of a unified Roman world was effectively over. Justinian's reconquests had briefly stitched parts of the empire back together, but maintaining those territories required stable tax income and manpower, both of which had been deeply reduced. The plague continued resurfacing in waves throughout the late 6th and 7th centuries, preventing demographic recovery. Each recurrence reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. The empire shifted its focus toward fortification and defense, slowly transforming into what historians would later call the Byzantine state. More Greek in culture, more defensive in posture, and less expansive in ambition. In Western Europe, the weakening of centralized authority accelerated the rise of localized power structures. Former Roman provinces solidified into independent kingdoms, such as the Franks under the Merovingians. Without strong imperial coordination, infrastructure maintenance declined. Roads deteriorated. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Urban centers shrank further. Economic life increasingly revolved around rural estates and self-sufficient agricultural communities. This was not necessarily a collapse into chaos, but it marked a clear departure from the interconnected Roman system that had dominated for centuries. The Church, however, gained relative stability during this time. As political systems weakened, Ecclesiastical structures often remained intact. Bishops and monasteries became centers of continuity. In times of famine and plague, monasteries sometimes provided food distribution and basic care. Religious authority filled gaps left by weakened civil administration. The spiritual interpretation of the disasters of the 530s and 540s reinforced the Church's moral authority. If the sun had dimmed as divine warning, then spiritual leadership offered explanation and guidance. In Ireland and Britain, regions already peripheral to the former Roman core, monastic communities flourished. These communities preserved texts, maintained agricultural knowledge, and fostered intellectual continuity. While much of continental Europe contracted economically, centers of learning quietly persisted in unexpected places. The transformation of the late antique world into the medieval world was not purely decline, it was reorganization. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, archaeological layers suggest cultural shifts that may reflect both trauma and adaptation. Burial practices evolved. Elite goods reappear later in different patterns, hinting at social restructuring. Some scholars suggest that the population collapse created opportunities for emerging leaders to consolidate power over larger territories once recovery began. Over generations, this restructuring may have contributed to the maritime expansion and raiding culture that would define the Viking Age centuries later. While the link is indirect, demographic shock often sets the stage for future mobility and ambition. Further east, Central Asian steppe movements continued shaping the political landscape. Environmental stress rarely affects only settled farmers. Pastoral nomads are equally dependent on stable ecosystems. If grazing patterns shifted during the late antique cooling, nomadic confederations would have been forced to seek new territories. Such movements placed pressure on border regions, influencing military and political dynamics far beyond the initial climate event. In China, after decades of fragmentation and instability, the Sui dynasty emerged in 589, reunifying large portions of the country. The ability to consolidate power after such hardship demonstrates resilience. The climatic downturn did not permanently destabilize East Asia, but it contributed to cycles of famine and reform that tested governance systems. When dynasties survive environmental crisis, they often do so by restructuring administration, investing in infrastructure, and tightening control. Culturally, the memory of environmental instability deepened spiritual intensity across regions. Apocalyptic themes remained powerful in Christian writings. In parts of the Near East, religious communities interpreted natural disaster through theological frameworks emphasizing repentance and moral renewal. The sense that cosmic order could falter reinforced humility before divine authority. Modern historians increasingly see 536 not as an isolated anomaly, but as a hinge between historical eras. The combination of volcanic cooling, repeated eruptions, and pandemic plague formed one of the most severe clusters of crises in recorded history prior to the Black Death. This cluster accelerated trends already underway: urban contraction, rural dominance, political fragmentation, and hastened the emergence of the medieval world. What makes this transformation particularly striking is how invisible its origin would have seemed to those living through it. No one in Constantinople or Gaul or China saw the eruption that likely triggered the initial darkness. The volcano stood far away, possibly in Iceland, its ash rising silently into the stratosphere. Yet its particles circled the globe, dimming sunlight across continents. The connection between eruption and famine remained unknown for over 1,000 years. Only with modern ice core analysis and climate modeling have scholars reconstructed the scale of the event. Sulfate deposits in Greenland ice precisely match the timeline of 6th century accounts. Tree rings from Europe, Asia, and even North America show abrupt cooling beginning in 536. The synchronization across regions confirms that this was not regional weather fluctuation. It was a hemispheric, atmospheric event, and still humanity endured. Societies contracted but did not vanish. Knowledge shifted but did not disappear. Political systems reformed under new realities. Trade diminished but later revived. Populations fell but gradually rebounded. The sky cleared, though slowly. Crops returned, though cautiously. Life continued under altered conditions. By the close of the 6th century, the world looked different than it had in 530. Empires were weaker. Cities were smaller. Rural life dominated. Religious authority was stronger. Migration patterns had shifted. Yet the continuity of civilization remained intact. The year 536 was the spark, but the transformation lasted decades. It revealed how dependent complex societies are on environmental stability, and how quickly that stability can unravel. At the same time, it revealed something equally powerful. Even when sunlight dims and disease spreads, human communities adapt, reorganize, and persist. As historians and climate scientists continue piecing together the story of 536 and its aftermath, what becomes clearer with each decade of research is just how globally synchronized this crisis truly was. The dimming of the sun was not confined to one empire or one culture. From the Mediterranean to East Asia, from the British Isles to the steppes of Central Asia, records, though written in different languages and framed by different beliefs, describe an unusual darkness, cold summers, and failing harvests. These parallel accounts, once treated as isolated anomalies, now align with remarkable precision when placed alongside physical climate evidence. Ice cores drilled deep beneath Greenland's surface preserve microscopic particles of volcanic sulfate trapped in layers of frozen time. When scientists analyzed these layers, they discovered massive spikes around the year 536, followed by another around 540. These chemical signatures correspond with what would be expected from a powerful volcanic eruption, ejecting sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. Once in the upper atmosphere, sulfur particles reflect incoming sunlight, cooling the surface below. Unlike typical weather patterns which shift within days or weeks, stratospheric aerosols can persist for years, altering global climate cycles. Tree ring studies reinforce this picture. Trees add one growth ring per year, and the width of each ring reflects environmental conditions. Narrow rings indicate stress, often from cold or drought. Across Europe, Siberia, Central Asia, and even parts of North America, trees from 536 onward show dramatically reduced growth. This simultaneous suppression across continents confirms that the cooling was not local. It was hemispheric. Climate models suggest that average summer temperatures in parts of Europe may have fallen by as much as 2 degrees Celsius. In agricultural societies already operating near the edge of productive viability, such a drop is devastating. Crops require specific temperature thresholds to ripen. If those thresholds are not reached consistently, yields decline sharply. A few degrees can determine whether grain matures or fails entirely. Monsoon systems may also have been disrupted. Some scholars propose that weakening of Asian monsoons contributed to crop failures in China during this period. The interconnectedness of atmospheric systems means that one eruption can ripple outward, affecting rainfall patterns thousands of miles away. This interconnectedness was invisible to 6th century observers, but it shaped their fate nonetheless. When climate instability converges with disease, the effects multiply. The plague of Justinian, emerging in 541, did not arise directly from volcanic ash. However, environmental stress can influence rodent populations, migration patterns, and trade flows, all factors that affect disease transmission. Malnutrition weakens immune defenses, making populations more vulnerable to infection. Thus, while the plague had its own biological origins, the weakened state of societies in the 540s made its impact far more severe. The demographic consequences were profound. Some historians estimate that the Byzantine Empire may have lost up to 1/3 or more of its population during the initial plague waves. Similar declines likely occurred in parts of the Mediterranean and Near East. In Europe's northern regions, population loss appears to have been equally dramatic, though harder to quantify precisely. Such widespread mortality reshapes inheritance patterns, land ownership, military capacity, and economic productivity for generations. One of the most significant long-term effects of this period was the acceleration of the transition from the classical world to the medieval one. The Roman world had long relied on dense urban centers, complex trade networks, and centralized taxation. After 536 and the plague waves that followed, maintaining that level of integration became increasingly difficult. Smaller, localized economies proved more sustainable under reduced population density. Political authority became more regional. The grand interconnected Mediterranean system gradually gave way to a patchwork of kingdoms and rural estates. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire also suffered from plague and environmental stress. Weakened rivals on both sides of the Byzantine-Persian frontier left the region vulnerable to new forces emerging in the 7th century. Within decades, Islamic armies would expand rapidly across territories once dominated by exhausted empires. While 536 did not directly cause these later transformations, it reduced resilience at a critical historical moment. What is remarkable is that for over a millennium, the connection between the dimmed sun of 536 and global volcanic activity remained unknown. Chroniclers described what they saw, but without the tools to analyze ice cores or atmospheric chemistry, they could not trace cause to origin. It was only in the 20th century, with advances in paleoclimatology and geology, that the pieces began aligning. Scholars realized that 6th century texts describing weak sunlight were not symbolic exaggeration. They were eyewitness accounts of planetary-scale atmospheric change. This realization reshaped historical interpretation. The 6th century is no longer viewed solely as a political or military turning point, but as an environmental one. Climate, once treated as background, emerged as a central actor in shaping late antiquity. Yet amid all the devastation, what stands out most is continuity. Societies contracted, but they did not disappear. Agriculture adjusted to cooler conditions. Political systems reorganized. Religious institutions strengthened their influence. Trade diminished but later revived in altered forms. The medieval world that followed was not born in isolation. It was forged in response to crisis. For individuals living in the 540s and 550s, None of this appeared as grand historical transformation. It appeared as hunger, illness, uncertainty, and adaptation. Children born during those years grew up under skies that gradually brightened again. To them, the earlier years of dim sunlight became stories told by elders. Memory softened. Life stabilized, though on different terms. The year 536, then, represents both fragility and endurance. It shows how dependent human systems are on environmental stability. It also shows how adaptable those systems can become when stability collapses. The sky dimmed, crops failed, disease spread, empires weakened, and yet humanity persisted, reorganized, and moved forward into a new historical era shaped quietly by that distant volcanic eruption. As the 6th century gradually gave way to the 7th, the world that emerged from the shadow of 536 was recognizably different from the one that had entered it. The transformation was not marked by a single declaration or treaty. It unfolded quietly through altered landscapes, diminished populations, and recalibrated expectations. Fields once cultivated at the margins of viability were abandoned. Trade routes once crowded with merchants thinned. Political ambition narrowed under the weight of limited resources. The crisis did not destroy civilization, but it reshaped its scale. One of the most enduring changes lay in how societies understood vulnerability. In the classical Roman world, stability had often been associated with imperial strength and infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, administrative networks, and armies symbolized permanence. Yet the events beginning in 536 demonstrated that even the most organized state could not command the atmosphere. No decree could restore sunlight. No legion could fight a volcanic winter. The realization may not have been articulated in scientific terms, but it was experienced viscerally. Human systems rested beneath forces far larger than political authority. The agricultural impact alone reverberated for decades. Farming communities operate on cycles of knowledge passed down through generations. When to plant, when to harvest, which varieties survive local conditions. The abrupt cooling disrupted those rhythms. Some regions adapted by shifting crop types or reducing cultivated acreage. Others consolidated land ownership as smaller farms failed. This consolidation may have contributed to the growing prominence of large estates in parts of Europe, reinforcing a rural aristocratic order that would define the medieval period. Demographic contraction also influenced military organization. With fewer able-bodied men available for service, states had to reconsider recruitment strategies. Mercenary reliance increased in certain regions. Defensive fortifications became more important than expansive campaigns. The Byzantine Empire, facing both plague and climate stress, increasingly prioritized border defense and internal cohesion. Expansionist dreams gave way to pragmatic survival. In Western Europe, the contraction of urban life meant that knowledge transmission shifted further into monastic environments. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, maintained literacy, and acted as local centers of continuity. In times of famine and instability, they also served practical roles in food storage and distribution. The environmental crisis of the mid-6th century indirectly strengthened the institutional role of the Church by increasing reliance on stable religious networks amid weakened secular administration. In Scandinavia, the long recovery period likely influenced patterns of settlement and leadership formation. As populations rebounded in the centuries that followed, New power centers emerged and reorganized societies. Maritime mobility, already part of northern culture, may have become more attractive in regions where agricultural potential remained uncertain. Environmental shock does not create seafaring tradition, but it can accelerate adaptation and exploration. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East faced similar restructuring. The Sasanian Empire endured both plague and prolonged warfare with Byzantium. By the early 7th century, both empires were exhausted. Within this context of reduced demographic resilience and strained economies, the rapid expansion of Islamic forces in the 630s and 640s becomes more comprehensible. The groundwork for that transformation was laid partly by decades of cumulative stress that began with environmental disruption. Modern comparison inevitably arises. When scholars study 536, they see an early example of global climate disturbance altering human systems. The volcanic eruptions of the 6th century were natural, unpredictable events. Today, climate change stems largely from human activity. Yet the underlying lesson remains consistent. Shifts in temperature and precipitation patterns ripple outward into food production, disease vulnerability, migration, and political stability. The world of 536 was less technologically advanced, but it was not less complex. Its fragility under environmental shock offers a historical mirror for understanding systemic vulnerability. Scientific advances have clarified the likely source of the 536 eruption. Many researchers now point toward Iceland, possibly the Eldgjá volcanic system, though debate continues. Regardless of the precise volcano, the magnitude of aerosol release was sufficient to alter hemispheric climate. Subsequent eruptions around 540 compounded the effect. This cluster of eruptions created one of the coldest decades in the last 2 millennia. According to multiple paleoclimate reconstructions, what distinguishes 536 from other difficult years in history is the layering of crises. Environmental cooling was followed by pandemic plague. Political strain intensified under demographic collapse. Economic networks contracted. Migration patterns shifted. The events formed a chain rather than a single episode. That chain reoriented late antiquity into the early medieval world. Yet amid all analysis, the lived experience must not be forgotten. For a farmer in Gaul or a merchant in Alexandria, the crisis was not an abstract global phenomenon. It was a thinning harvest, a neighbor lost to disease, a tax collector demanding payment from an empty granary. It was fear at sunrise when the light seemed too faint. It was uncertainty about whether the next year would bring relief. Over time, memory softened. New generations inherited a world already adjusted to reduced scale. For them, the mid-6th century was not a turning point. It was simply history. The medieval world took shape under altered conditions, its institutions forged partly in response to environmental stress. The year 536 stands as a reminder that history is not shaped solely by kings, battles, or laws. Sometimes it is shaped by ash drifting invisibly through the upper atmosphere, dimming the sun across continents. Sometimes it is shaped by a temperature drop of 2 degrees, enough to tip balance into famine. Sometimes it is shaped by microscopic bacteria spreading along weakened trade routes. Civilization endured, but it endured differently. The classical world receded. The medieval world emerged. And at the hinge between them, the dim sun of 536 cast a long shadow over human destiny. As we move further beyond the immediate decades of disruption, The true scale of what began in 536 becomes clearer when placed against the longer arc of world history. This was not simply a regional famine or a temporary climatic anomaly. It was one of the earliest clearly documented examples of a global environmental shock interacting with complex human systems. The 6th century stood at a crossroads already marked by transition. The Roman world had been slowly transforming for generations, but the atmospheric events beginning in 536 accelerated that transformation in ways that political narratives alone cannot explain. Before 536, the Mediterranean remained a tightly interconnected economic system. Grain moved from Egypt to Constantinople. Goods traveled from Syria to Italy. Silver, silk, wine, olive oil, and ceramics circulated across vast distances. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Mediterranean preserved much of this integrated structure. But integration requires stability. It requires predictable harvests, healthy labor forces, and reliable taxation. When the sky dimmed and harvests failed repeatedly, integration faltered. The plague waves that began in 541 compounded this instability. Unlike earlier localized outbreaks, the plague of Justinian recurred over decades. Each resurgence struck populations already struggling to recover. Some historians argued that this prolonged demographic suppression prevented a quick rebound in urban density. Cities remained smaller. Trade volumes stayed reduced. Infrastructure decayed more rapidly without sufficient labor to maintain it. It is important to understand that the 6th century was not a collapse into chaos. It was a narrowing. Systems that had once supported millions across interconnected regions contracted into smaller, more sustainable frameworks. The Mediterranean economy became less dominant. Localized economies rose in importance. Political authority decentralized in Western Europe while becoming more defensive in the East. Comparatively, later disasters such as the Black Death in the 14th century are often more famous because documentation is richer and recovery more visibly transformative. Yet the 6th century crisis may have been equally severe in proportion to global population at the time. What distinguishes 536 is that it came during a period already characterized by political transition. The environmental shock did not strike a stable golden age. It struck a world in flux, amplifying ongoing changes. In Eurasia's northern zones, cooler temperatures may have shortened agricultural expansion that had slowly been pushing into marginal lands. Population decline reduced pressure to farm those lands again for generations. Forests reclaimed space. Settlement density decreased. These shifts altered the economic geography of Europe. Regions that would later become central to medieval power structures were reshaped during this quieter, darker era. In the Near East and Persia, the long war between Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire in the early 7th century exhausted both states. Environmental stress and plague had weakened them decades earlier. When Islamic forces emerged from Arabia in the 630s, they encountered rivals already strained. The rapid expansion that followed was not caused by 536, but the diminished resilience of established powers made swift transformation possible. East Asia presents a different pattern. While the climatic downturn brought hardship, dynastic recovery followed more quickly under the Sui and Tang. Large-scale infrastructural projects such as the Grand Canal helped stabilize grain transport and administrative cohesion. The Chinese state demonstrated resilience through reform and centralization. This contrast highlights that environmental shocks do not produce uniform outcomes. Political adaptability matters. From a modern perspective, what makes 536 especially significant is its interdisciplinary conformation. For centuries, historians debated the reliability of 6th century chroniclers describing dim sunlight. Today, paleoclimate science confirms that they were witnessing atmospheric phenomena on a global scale. The combination of ice core data, volcanic ash analysis, dendrochronology, and written sources creates one of the most compelling reconstructions of ancient climate disaster ever assembled. This convergence also reshapes how historians interpret the transition from antiquity to the medieval period. Rather than viewing the shift solely as political fragmentation following Rome's fall, scholars now consider environmental stress as a major catalyst. Climate does not determine history, but it constrains possibilities. It narrows options, forces adaptation, and exposes weaknesses. The people who lived through the 530s and 540s did not see themselves as part of a climatic turning point. They experienced hunger, disease, uncertainty, and fear. They responded with prayer, migration, reorganization, and endurance. Over time, those responses solidified into new social patterns. The medieval world did not appear suddenly. It emerged gradually from layers of adaptation. What began with a dimmed sun in 536 rippled outward through plague, demographic collapse, economic contraction, political realignment, and cultural transformation. It reminds us that history often moves not through single dramatic events, but through chains of interconnected disruptions. An eruption far from population centers altered sunlight. Altered sunlight weakened harvests. Weakened harvests magnified disease. Disease reshaped empires. And yet even within this cascade of hardship, the continuity of human society persisted. Language endured. Faith endured. Governance endured in altered form. The world did not end, though it felt as if it might have. Instead, it transformed, quietly, steadily, into something new. As we step back even further and look at the world shaped by the shadow of 536, what becomes increasingly clear is that this was not merely a climatic event layered onto history. It became part of the foundation upon which the medieval world was built. The dimming of the sun and the cold summers that followed did not just weaken harvests for a few seasons. They shifted demographic balance, slowed economic momentum, redirected political ambition, and redefined what stability meant across vast regions of Eurasia. Before this period, the remnants of the Roman system still lingered in the Mediterranean. Trade was active. Cities were functioning hubs of administration. Communication between distant regions, though weakened from its classical peak, remained substantial. But after the climate shock and plague waves, scale diminished. It is not that civilization disappeared. It recalibrated to a lower intensity. Fewer people meant fewer goods in motion. Fewer taxpayers meant fewer imperial projects. Fewer soldiers meant less offensive warfare. The world contracted into something quieter and more regional. In Western Europe, this contraction deepened the rural character of society. Estates became the primary units of production. Land, rather than trade, defined wealth. Urban populations did not vanish entirely, but cities were no longer engines of growth in the way they had been under Roman administration. This period quietly prepared the ground for the feudal relationships that would define much of medieval Europe. Land, protection, and loyalty became central organizing principles. A system well suited to a world where long-distance stability could no longer be assumed. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire adapted differently. It did not dissolve into small kingdoms. Instead, it reorganized into a more militarized and defensive state. Administrative reforms in later centuries, such as the theme system, allowed the empire to maintain cohesion despite demographic loss. This resilience shows that environmental crisis does not automatically produce collapse. It produces pressure. States that adapt survive in altered form. Across Central Asia, climate variability may have continued influencing migration patterns long after the initial eruptions. Pastoral societies are acutely sensitive to environmental shifts. A cooler climate changes grazing cycles. Changed grazing cycles shift settlement and movement. These shifts affect border regions and trade corridors. Over time, such movements reshape the political landscape of Eurasia in ways not immediately visible but deeply influential. In China, state centralization eventually overcame the hardships of the mid-6th century. Large-scale infrastructural investment helped restore grain distribution networks. The Tang dynasty that followed became one of the most powerful and culturally influential in Chinese history. This contrast highlights an important lesson. Environmental shock tests political systems, but outcomes depend on institutional flexibility and leadership capacity. What makes 536 especially powerful as a historical case study is that it reveals the layered nature of crisis. Climate alone did not redefine the world. Disease alone did not redefine the world. Political fragmentation alone did not redefine the world. But together, in rapid succession, they created a cumulative effect far greater than any single factor. The 6th century became a hinge, not because one thing happened, but because several things happened at once. Modern research into the late antique Little Ice Age suggests that cooling conditions may have persisted, with fluctuations, into the mid-7th century. This prolonged environmental strain meant that recovery was gradual and uneven. Regions that rebounded did so slowly. Others lagged. Population growth remained suppressed for generations. The demographic baseline of the Mediterranean world never fully returned to its pre-536 level during late antiquity. And yet, the most striking aspect of this story is endurance. Human societies, even when reduced in number and scale, continued to function. Agriculture adapted to new conditions. Political systems evolved. Religious institutions gained cohesion. Cultural memory absorbed the trauma. Over time, the catastrophe of 536 faded into chronicles and oral tradition, even as its structural effects remained embedded in the medieval order. The year 536 stands as a reminder that the forces shaping history often lie beyond human intention. Kings plan campaigns. Merchants negotiate trade. Farmers plant crops. But when the atmosphere shifts, when sunlight dims, when temperatures fall, human agency narrows. Choices shrink. Survival becomes the central task. Yet narrowing is not annihilation. It is transformation. The classical world did not end in fire and conquest alone. It dimmed gradually, in part under a veiled sun. The medieval world emerged not only from political realignment, but from adaptation to environmental instability. In that sense, 536 is not just the worst year to be alive in terms of hardship. It is one of the most revealing years in terms of understanding how fragile and interconnected human systems truly are. It shows how environmental shock can ripple outward into economics, politics, migration, and belief. It shows how vulnerability and resilience coexist. The sun eventually returned to full brightness. Crops stabilized, generations passed, but the world they inherited carried subtle marks of that decade of darkness. Marks etched not only into ice cores and tree rings, but into the very structure of the societies that would define the Middle Ages. As we move even deeper into the long shadow cast by the events of 536, it becomes important to consider not only political and economic transformation, but memory, how societies remember catastrophe, and how those memories quietly influence the stories they tell about themselves. Environmental disasters do not simply pass through history as statistics of cold years and failed crops. They settle into myth, religion, and cultural imagination. In the centuries after 536, apocalyptic imagery remained powerful in Christian Europe and the Near East. Sermons emphasized the fragility of earthly life. Chroniclers wrote of divine signs in the sky. While it would be simplistic to claim that all apocalyptic thinking in the early medieval period originated from the volcanic winter, it is equally difficult to ignore how such a dramatic celestial disturbance could reinforce belief that the natural order itself was subject to sudden upheaval. When the sun dims for months, theological language finds fertile ground. In Scandinavia, later Norse mythology tells of Fimbulwinter, a great and terrible winter that precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world. The description includes years of cold and hardship, social breakdown, and survival against overwhelming environmental pressure. Scholars debate the direct connection, but it is possible that cultural memory preserved echoes of 6th century climatic trauma. Oral traditions often compress centuries into symbolic narrative. A generation that endured severe cold might pass that memory forward in mythic form. In Ireland, monastic annals refer to failure of bread during the late 530s. These short, understated entries capture immense suffering in minimal language. They reflect how communities recorded crisis without fully grasping its global scale. Each region experienced its hardship locally, yet modern research shows those hardships were synchronized across continents. What is particularly striking is how invisible the true cause remained for more than 1,000 years. Medieval scholars did not suspect volcanic aerosols. They did not imagine Icelandic eruptions affecting Mediterranean harvests. The atmosphere itself was not yet understood as a global system. Instead, disaster was interpreted morally or spiritually. This interpretation shaped medieval worldview profoundly. Stability was seen as divine blessing. Instability as warning. From a broader historical perspective, 536 invites comparison with other climatic turning points. The Black Death of the 14th century reshaped Europe through disease and demographic collapse. The Little Ice Age between the 14th and 19th centuries altered agricultural patterns and social stability. Yet 536 stands apart because it represents one of the earliest clearly documented global volcanic winters intersecting with pandemic disease. It reveals how climate and biology can combine to accelerate systemic change. Another important comparison lies in resilience. Unlike the Bronze Age collapse centuries earlier, where entire civilizations disappeared, the 6th century world contracted but endured. The Roman state did not vanish overnight. Chinese dynasties reorganized rather than dissolving permanently. Even in regions hardest hit, communities adapted. This suggests that while environmental shock can weaken systems, institutional flexibility determines survival. The recovery that followed was gradual. By the later 7th century, population growth resumed in some areas. Agricultural production stabilized. Trade revived under new political structures. The early medieval world, shaped by smaller urban centers and stronger rural estates, matured into a different but functional system. Monastic networks preserved literacy and agricultural knowledge. Regional kingdoms consolidated power. Cultural identities solidified under new conditions. Modern historians increasingly view the 6th century as a pivotal hinge between antiquity and the medieval world. It was not a single decisive moment, but a convergence of pressures: climate, disease, warfare, migration. 536 sits at the beginning of that convergence. It marks the start of a decade where sunlight itself became uncertain. When we reflect on 536 today, we do so with tools unimaginable to its witnesses. Ice cores reveal chemical signatures. Tree rings reveal suppressed growth. Climate models simulate aerosol dispersion. The scientific clarity we now possess allows us to see the event as planetary in scale. But the people who lived through it saw only their fields, their markets, their skies, and perhaps that is what makes 536 so haunting. It reminds us that global forces often manifest as personal hardship. A distant eruption becomes a hungry child. A stratospheric aerosol cloud becomes a failed harvest. A cooling temperature becomes a weakened immune system. The medieval world that followed carried subtle imprints of this decade of darkness. Political ambitions narrowed. Rural life deepened. Religious intensity strengthened. Trade recalibrated. The classical Mediterranean order faded further into memory, replaced by a new structure more suited to a less stable world. The year 536 was not an isolated anomaly. It was a threshold, a moment when environmental vulnerability reshaped human trajectory. It demonstrated that civilization's greatest challenges sometimes arrive silently, without warning, drifting high above in unseen layers of atmosphere. And as the centuries moved forward, the memory of the dimmed sun became legend, chronicle, and eventually data. But its influence remained embedded in the very foundations of the medieval era that emerged from its shadow. As we continue tracing the long arc that began with the dimming of the sun in 536, it becomes clearer that this was not merely a disaster layered onto history, but a force that quietly redirected its current. The classical world had already been changing, but after the 530s and 540s, the pace of that change intensified. Systems built for abundance had to adjust to scarcity. Structures designed for expansion had to learn contraction. Expectations narrowed, and with them, the shape of civilization shifted. One of the most profound transformations occurred in how societies measured security. In the Roman world, stability had been associated with urban prosperity, large-scale trade, and imperial reach. After the crisis years, security increasingly meant something smaller and more localized. A well-fortified town, a self-sufficient estate, a loyal network of kin. These became more reliable foundations than distant imperial guarantees. The psychological landscape of the Mediterranean changed. Grand visions of universal empire gave way to pragmatic survival. Economic contraction left long shadows. When populations fall sharply, markets shrink. Fewer consumers mean reduced demand for goods. Artisans lose buyers. Merchants scale back operations. Infrastructure once maintained by dense taxation networks begins to decay. Over time, entire professions diminish. The Mediterranean trading system did not disappear, but its intensity lessened. Regional trade replaced intercontinental exchange in many areas. Luxury goods became rarer, and local production gained importance. In the countryside, the transformation was equally significant. With marginal lands abandoned due to cooling and population decline, agriculture became more concentrated in reliable zones. Forests reclaimed territory once cleared for cultivation. This rewilding was not environmental policy. It was demographic consequence. Land without farmers returns to nature. Over generations, this altered the ecological map of Europe, subtly influencing future agricultural patterns and settlement expansion. Religious institutions absorbed much of the social strain. Monasteries and churches became anchors of continuity. They preserved knowledge, maintained written records, and offered spiritual explanations for suffering. The disasters of the mid-6th century reinforced the belief that worldly power was fragile. This worldview strengthened the appeal of spiritual stability. In many regions, ecclesiastical authority expanded as secular systems faltered. Politically, the weakening of large empires created openings for new configurations of power. The Byzantine Empire survived, but more defensive and less expansive. In the West, regional kingdoms solidified. In the Near East, exhausted imperial rivals faced emerging forces that would soon reshape the region entirely. The rapid expansion of Islamic polities in the 7th century cannot be attributed solely to the events of 536, yet it unfolded in a world already destabilized by decades of cumulative stress. Environmental historians often describe the 6th century as a stress test for late antique civilization. It exposed the limits of agricultural resilience. It revealed the vulnerability of interconnected trade networks. It demonstrated how disease can exploit weakened societies. But it also highlighted adaptability. Communities reorganized rather than vanished. Political systems restructured rather than collapsed completely. The global dimension of the crisis is perhaps its most striking feature. Though 6th century observers had no concept of atmospheric circulation patterns, the event was truly hemispheric. From Irish annals to Byzantine chronicles to Chinese court records, references to abnormal climate align with scientific evidence. This convergence allows modern scholars to see the mid-6th century not as isolated regional hardship, but as shared planetary experience. Yet shared experience did not mean shared awareness. Each society interpreted its crisis through its own framework. Christians saw divine warning. Chinese officials saw cosmic imbalance affecting the mandate of heaven. Norse traditions later remembered a terrible winter preceding upheaval. Interpretation varied, but the physical phenomenon was the same. What unfolded after 536 was not a dramatic rebirth. It was a slow recalibration. The world did not brighten instantly once aerosols cleared. The damage done by famine and plague required generations to repair. The children born in the 550s and 560s inherited a world already scaled down from its classical peak. For them, this narrower world was normal. Over time, that new normal solidified into the early medieval order. Rural estates became foundational units of power. Fortified settlements dotted the landscape. Religious networks linked communities across political boundaries. Trade continued, but in modified form. The memory of imperial scale faded further into history. In this way, 536 stands not only as a year of darkness, but as a hinge between eras. The classical Mediterranean world, still echoing with Roman ambition, dimmed under environmental stress. The medieval world, more localized and spiritually centered, emerged in its place. The dimmed sun did not erase humanity. It reshaped it. It narrowed horizons but did not extinguish hope. It tested resilience and revealed fragility. It showed that climate, invisible and distant, can alter the course of empires without a single sword drawn. And as the decades passed and the skies regained clarity, the transformation remained. Embedded in altered demographics, new political boundaries, reoriented economies, and cultural memories, shaped by a time when even the sun seemed uncertain. As the generations born after the crisis of 536 grew into adulthood, the world they inhabited no longer remembered the brightness that had preceded the dimmed skies. For them, the narrower systems, the quieter cities, the rural dominance, and the stronger hold of religious authority were not signs of loss. They were simply reality. This is how transformation becomes permanent, not through dramatic endings, but through the normalization of change. The Mediterranean world that had once pulsed with Roman coordination had now adjusted to fragmentation. Political authority in the West rested in the hands of regional rulers who governed smaller populations over more limited territories. Their power depended less on vast bureaucratic machinery and more on personal loyalty, land control, and military defense. This gradual localization of authority shaped what historians later recognized as the medieval order. The seeds of feudal relationships, obligation in exchange for protection, were planted in soil made unstable by environmental and demographic shock. In the East, the Byzantine Empire endured, but it endured as something transformed. Administrative reforms slowly emerged over the following century, aiming to adapt governance to reduced manpower and revenue. The empire shifted toward a structure that tied military service to landholding, ensuring defense without relying solely on a diminished tax base. This adjustment reflected a broader truth revealed by 536: survival required flexibility. Institutions that adapted continued. Those that resisted change weakened further. The demographic decline of the mid-6th century had long-term implications for labor distribution and land use. With fewer people to cultivate fields, agricultural production remained conservative. Risk-taking in marginal lands decreased. Rural communities prioritized stability over expansion. Over time, as population slowly rebounded, the structure of landholding remained shaped by that earlier contraction. Estates consolidated during hardship retained influence during recovery. Trade, though diminished, never disappeared entirely. Instead, it reorganized around more stable corridors and political boundaries. Maritime exchange in the Mediterranean persisted, but volumes were reduced compared to earlier centuries. Overland trade across Eurasia continued through steppe networks and Silk Road connections, though subject to the shifting political landscapes shaped partly by environmental pressure and migration. In cultural terms, the memory of instability strengthened spiritual frameworks. The belief that earthly life was fragile and dependent on divine will became deeply embedded in medieval consciousness. When harvest failed and disease spread, explanation was sought not in unseen atmospheric chemistry, but in cosmic order. This worldview shaped law, art, architecture, and literature for centuries to come. One of the most significant insights modern historians draw from 536 is the interconnectedness of systems. A volcanic eruption in a remote region altered atmospheric transparency. Reduced sunlight disrupted agriculture. Agricultural failure weakened immune systems. Disease exploited weakened populations. Political and economic systems strained under demographic collapse. Migration patterns shifted under environmental pressure. Each element fed into the next. The crisis was not singular. It was cumulative. The term Late Antique Little Ice Age captures this extended period of cooling and instability from roughly 536 into the mid-7th century. Though not as prolonged as later climatic shifts, its timing made it uniquely influential. It intersected with a world already undergoing political reconfiguration after Rome's decline. It intensified transition rather than creating entirely new patterns. What is especially remarkable is how modern science reconstructed this story. Ice cores extracted from Greenland reveal sulfur deposits matching the timeline of 6th century chronicles. Tree rings from Europe, Asia, and North America display synchronized growth suppression. Volcanic ash layers confirm powerful eruptions. These independent strands of evidence converge to validate ancient accounts once dismissed as exaggeration. For those who lived through it, however, there was no data, no model, no global perspective. There was only uncertainty. Crops failed. Temperatures remained low. Markets emptied. Illness spread. Faith intensified. Survival required adaptation. Over decades, adaptation became structure. The medieval world solidified around smaller, more defensible units. Religious institutions expanded their influence. Rural economies dominated. Urban revival would not fully accelerate again in Europe until centuries later. Thus, 536 stands as both catastrophe and catalyst. It marks one of the coldest decades in 2 millennia. It aligns with one of the earliest recorded pandemics. It coincides with political and economic reorientation across continents. It does not act alone in history, but it amplifies every vulnerability present at the time. The dimmed sun of 536 may have lasted months or years, but its shadow stretched across generations. It narrowed ambition, restructured governance, reshaped demography, and deepened spiritual reliance. It became a quiet turning point, not announced by proclamations but etched into the foundations of the medieval era, and as centuries continued to pass, the direct memory faded. The chronicles remained. The myths endured. The ice preserved its chemical record. But daily life moved forward, shaped subtly yet permanently, by a time when the sky itself seemed uncertain. As we arrive at the far edge of this long shadow that began in the year 536, we can finally step back and see the full arc of what unfolded. It began not with armies, nor with speeches, nor with declarations of war, but with something far quieter. A dimming of the sun, a veil in the sky, a subtle reduction in warmth that few could explain, yet all could feel. From that dimmed sunlight flowed a chain of consequences. Harvests weakened, food became scarce, bodies grew thin, immune systems faltered. Disease found pathways through trade routes and crowded cities. The plague of Justinian spread into a world already strained. Populations declined, economies narrowed, political systems recalibrated. What had once been a vast, interconnected Mediterranean world became smaller, more regional, more cautious. The classical age did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It faded, slowly, unevenly, under environmental pressure layered atop political change. Urban life contracted, trade simplified, land became the center of stability. Religious authority expanded as secular structures struggled. Empires survived but transformed. Kingdoms formed in place of provinces. The medieval world did not suddenly appear. It emerged gradually from the adjustments forced by crisis. The 6th century revealed something enduring about human civilization. It showed that complex systems depend on fragile balances: temperature, rainfall, harvest cycles, demographic stability. When one element shifts, the effects ripple outward. A volcanic eruption in a distant northern land altered skies across continents. Invisible particles in the upper atmosphere reshaped economies thousands of miles away. The people living through it did not know the cause, but they felt the consequence. And yet this story is not only about fragility. It is also about endurance. Communities adapted, institutions restructured, belief systems offered meaning. Children were born into a changed world and learned to call it normal. The sun returned, crops stabilized, trade resumed in modified forms. The world continued, not as it had been, but as something new. Modern science, through ice cores and tree rings, allows us to reconstruct what ancient observers could only describe in confusion and awe. We now know that 536 marks one of the coldest decades of the past 2,000 years. We know that volcanic aerosols dimmed the sky. We know that climatic stress intersected with plague to accelerate transformation. But even with this knowledge, the human experience remains central. Imagine standing in a field in 536, watching grain fail to ripen beneath a pale sun. Imagine walking through a city where markets grow quiet and illness spreads. Imagine hearing rumors of distant lands suffering the same fate, yet not knowing why. For those living through it, it must have felt as if the world itself had shifted. And in many ways it had. The year 536 was not the end of civilization. It was a turning point hidden within the natural world. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by rulers and revolutions, but by climate, biology, and forces beyond immediate human control. It marks the threshold between antiquity and the medieval age, a bridge built not of stone, but of ash and cold air. When the skies finally cleared and sunlight returned in strength, humanity did not return to its former path. It moved forward along a different one. The medieval world took form in the space carved by environmental hardship. Institutions strengthened where needed, societies rebalanced, memory softened into chronicle and legend. And so when we ask why the year 536 is often called the worst year to be alive, the answer lies not in a single tragedy, but in the cascade that followed. It was a year when the atmosphere itself changed, a year when harvests failed across continents, a year that set into motion decades of disease and demographic decline, a year whose shadow shaped centuries. Yet even in the darkest skies humanity endured. The sun returned, civilization adapted, history continued. If you found this deep dive into the hidden turning point of 536 compelling, then like the video, Subscribe for more long-form, slow, deep history journeys, and let me know which ancient or medieval world we should walk through next. Until next time, another era, another quiet turning point in history.